Well, the first thing that I'd like to say is that I look forward to your questions. If they come up at any time, let me know. But I'll keep talking and talk you through my life as it's unfolded, particularly in the way in which I've gone about studying and learning about people and other topics. But let's start off with this idea that is one of my main interests, and that's about decision making. So here's a couple of questions for you, and I'll just put them up. These questions are the sorts of things that we might experience in Australia, for instance, where there's been a lot of talk about sharks lately. So here's a question: which is more likely cause of death? Okay, and this was in the United States, so it's similar to Australia. Being killed by falling airplane parts, that is a wheel or a hatch or something like that, or being killed by a shark. Now, when this particular survey was taken, you might be thinking to yourself, well, it's sharks because they're often on the news. And in fact, it was falling airplane parts, and the ratio was 30 times more likely in the United States to be killed by falling airplane parts than to be killed by a shark. And yet most of the people thought it was sharks. So let's go to this sort of area. So this is other causes of fatalities. Now, for each pair, which is the most common cause? Diabetes or homicide? Well, the people who were surveyed when this was done thought it was homicide, but in fact, it's diabetes. Tornado or lightning? Again, most people thought it was tornado, but in fact, it's lightning. And thirdly, car accidents or stomach cancer? Well, car accidents. Now, there's a bit of a theme developing here that I'll talk about later. In other words, what's often in the media, what often we hear about most, isn't actually the way things are. And I don't mean that to say that the media distort things, it's the amount of reporting and the things that we remember. This is some of the area that I do research in. But before I go on to talk about that in some detail, I'd like to tell you about my journey and in particular, my love of learning. Now, as a child, I was really fascinated by scientific documentaries, and as you can probably tell, I'm a little older than 21, and so these scientific documentaries were quite new on the television in particular, but even some of them at the movies. I liked nature shows about animals and the world, like shows about volcanoes or undersea creatures. These were things that really interested me. And there was a special show called Disneyland that was on each week, and it was a must-see because it had a lot of these sort of documentaries on it. And in fact, there was a segment in this TV show called Disneyland called Tomorrowland, and I really loved that. It explored scientific topics. It explored all kinds of things like space travel. It explored all kinds of things about the physical world, about the biological world. And so I found it a fascinating show and really, really enjoyed myself while watching it. And I can remember distinctly that one of these shows in Tomorrowland was about atomic physics. And I became fascinated by all things nuclear. At that stage, nuclear energy and nuclear technology wasn't as fraught with fearful images as it is today in the general public's mind. So as a young boy, I was pretty interested in this kind of thing. In fact, I was so interested that as about a 10-year-old, I wrote to the people who were, in New South Wales who did physics. These were professors of physics. And at this time, there were two that I could think of, and they were at University of New South Wales and University of Sydney, and I wanted to be a professor of physics. You may as well aim high when you're a youngster. So I wrote to these two professors, and in fact, one of them invited me to tour the physics department at his university. That was UNSW. So I actually went for a tour all around the physics department, the solar furnace, which was this giant machine that generated massive temperatures. So I had a wonderful time as this 12-year-old I was at that stage. My poor mum had to drive me there and wait in the coffee lounge and then come back and get me. So from there, at high school, I went on to study science. I really loved science. I loved the topics, I loved the way it was presented, and in fact I also enjoyed maths, which helped me with the science. Now, when I got to what's now called Year 11 and 12, but then was called 5th and 6th form, I studied first level science, and in fact I majored in biology. But I matriculated to Sydney University and I did a science degree in maths and physics. And I really enjoyed those subjects. I enjoyed them for the sorts of things we explored. At about this time, for instance, were the moon landings. And one of my professors then talked a lot about the mathematics associated with the moon landings. And we did some calculations about the flight of Apollo 11 from Earth to Moon. And I found all of that really interesting, just for the precision of mathematics, for the way in which it helped us describe the world. Now, I wanted to be a professor of physics, but unfortunately that wasn't possible. My grades weren't sufficient, but I did do well enough at physics to become a high school science teacher. And so I had this opportunity to go on and communicate my love of science to the students around me. I really enjoyed doing that, and especially my interest in physics. And at the time when I was a high school science teacher, there weren't many people who were specialist physics-trained teachers. I enjoyed it so much that I was able to do it for 12 years at 3 different high schools. So I had an opportunity teaching both boys and girls and communicating my love of this area of science, that is physics. However, as I was a maturing teacher, I became more interested in the broader context of students. So student welfare became an interest of mine. And I started to see how important factors outside the classroom were to student learning and to student success. And so I started to think about that, and I started to wonder, well, maybe there are other factors than just how good a teacher I am, or whether I'm a good teacher at all. So I took on a particular role that was then called the supervisor of boys, and that meant I had a specific role in the school I was at that I really needed to have a better understanding of how people ticked, what motivated them, what influence home life had, what influence peer groups had, all those kinds of things. So as I started to think carefully about that, I realised that this was an important area of school life, and to do a good job of it, I had to do better than have common sense. Now, I'll talk a little bit about common sense in a moment, but to do this well, I had to do it as well as I could possibly learn about it. This is going back to my love of learning and how I ended up making the decision to study psychology. So as I thought about that, needing to do better at it, I then decided to go back and study psychology at university. And lo and behold, I actually studied all my psychology at Macquarie University. It's an outstanding place to study psychology, as I can vouch for from my own studies over a long period of time. So I completed my initial psychology studies, and this time my grades were pretty reasonable, and I did honours, and I went on to do higher study. I actually ended up being able to do a PhD, and that was my qualification to study at a high level the nature of people and their thinking and the kinds of influences that work in how people react to the world around them and their social world. So eventually I left high school teaching. I made the decision that I wanted to do more with specifically people rather than just teaching science and physics and so forth. And so for a couple of years I worked in the family court as a court counsellor, and then for another few years I worked in various university counselling services. So I made my transition. The decision came sort of slowly at one level. It was influenced by the fact that I got good grades at psychology. I was better at it in the university studies than I'd been at my physics and mathematics studies. So it kind of was, the results helped me decide. But in another way, I also became quite interested in how people thought about their lives, how they made their decisions, what kinds of factors, both, say, in the schools where I'd worked, but also in life more generally, what were the things that really influenced people. So eventually, I was able to get a job at Macquarie University as a researcher and lecturer. And in fact, that was over 20 years ago. So I've been here for a long time, developing my research. And so my love of learning now is not just about teaching people, but it's also about creating new knowledge, because that's what a university is about. It's not just simply repeating what somebody else has found out, but thinking about problems or topics and trying to say, well, is there another way to understand this, or is there a better way that we can describe what we see going on around us and maybe think about that topic or this idea? Now, I want for a moment to talk about two important ideas in regards to psychology. And this is this idea of scientific psychology compared to folk psychology. Now, these two ideas are often confused in the minds of many people, and it's important to try and separate them in order to understand the sort of research that I'm going to talk about a little bit later on that I do. Now, folk psychology. It's important to think of it as what you learn from your family. It starts right as a small child, a very, very small child, as an infant. It's what you learn about how to treat people. You learn ways to behave in your family, your extended family, and then when you go to school, you learn expectations about what's good and what's not good. For instance, you'll often hear people talk about good parenting. It's the kind of thing you learn just by being in a society, just by being in a family. You absorb these ideas and you have a kind of understanding or a model of what's going on in the world around you. As you grow older, go through school, you join activities of the community. So it's not just the family anymore. It might be different social expectations in, say, sporting groups or in broader institutions. You might join some clubs or have friends from different social groups, so different church groups, for instance, in some cases. You know, you broaden your span of people you know. So this idea of a folk psychology is what we call a lay theory of what makes people tick, of what motivates them. And that's a really important part of how we get to be average, expectable, well-functioning human beings. We all need to have this one. And that's somewhat well illustrated if you want to think about it. I'm a fan of the Big Bang Theory, as would be understandable given my interest in physics. But Sheldon's odd behaviour at times is because his theory of what people are like is a bit unusual compared to the rest of us. So his folk psychology theory, I would suspect, as portrayed in the TV show, is somewhat unusual. And that's what gives it the humorous element. Well, this folk theory is a pretty good thing. It's a theory based on your experience, and so whilst it's good in the context you learn it, it's limited to your culture, society, family type, all kinds of things that are just your particular range of experience. And that's fair enough. That's where it works. That's where you live. But that's not scientific psychology. Scientific psychology uses the methods of science to study human thinking and behaviour. Now, I realise that's up on the slide, but I want to emphasise it by stating it clearly. You aim, if you're a scientific psychologist, as I would claim to be rigorous and try to develop the broadest possible models of human thinking and behaviour. So it's not about my particular social set, it's not about my particular family structure or family group or cultural or ethnic grouping. Scientific psychology is aimed at the broadest possible models of human development, human thinking, human behaviour. And so to do that, it has to do it via the methods of the scientific processes that you learn in both high school and then ultimately at university if you study psychology. Now, I want to get on to my special interests in psychology. I now research how people think and reason and make decisions in situations that are complex. So possibly this morning, and particularly if you're wearing school uniforms, you didn't have to make many decisions. You got up and you got into your school uniform, you caught the bus or you walked to school or whatever. They're not complex decisions. But what if you're making complex decisions about what career to follow? Or you're making decisions about what car to buy, or who to have a long-term relationship with, possibly even marry. These are complex decisions because they have many factors, they have large consequences, as in either financially or personally. These are the sorts of decisions I'm interested in. That is, the decisions that involve uncertainty, lots of information, and are important. So, the study of how people think applies to nearly every aspect, as I've said there, from buying a new phone to a job to apply for and who to marry. So the sort of things I look at are quite broad-ranging in terms of the topics. And I'm not the first person to be doing this by a long way. A lot has been found out about how we do this. And this has been through scientific psychology. It's been through processes that have been rigorously examined and carefully thought out and conducted in very good structured studies. Now, the first couple of things I just want to go through to indicate what we have learned. There's a part of the body of research which tells us people aren't very rational, and this is a movement called heuristics and biases. One of the most important people in this area is a chap by the name of Daniel Kahneman, who in fact won the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics for his work, because economics is, believe it or not, about how people make decisions, in his terms, rational economic decisions. So he found a number of biases that interfere with our thinking. Go back to the examples that we looked at right at the beginning of this talk. The one about the sharks and the airplane parts, the one about the diabetes, the various causes of death. The answers that people gave to these surveys were a result of these biases. Biases in the information environment in which they lived. They weren't deliberately being sort of difficult or trying not to tell the truth, but this was the state of their understanding of the world simply because of the information that they were exposed to. So representative heuristic, anchoring adjustment, and especially one that I'm interested in, confirmation bias. Another researcher in this area, Jonathan Evans, talks about reasoning biases where things are believable but not logical. There's another type, there's another approach to this called the adaptive heuristics approach. And this approach is different. It's championed by a guy by the name of Gerd Gigerenzer. He's a German. And his work has shown how, in fact, humans are not all that bad at reasoning in complex everyday situations. That's why he's called it adaptive heuristics rather than heuristics and biases. So that people have done pretty well and are pretty reasonable, that these heuristics are in fact effective in the environment that created them. Okay, so you've got this person or the thinking environment fit. Sounds a bit like Darwin, doesn't it? Well, let me go on to Darwin, because I want to talk about Darwin's decision to marry. Now, the way he did it was to divide a sheet of paper into two columns and put the headings marry, not marry. And in column 1, he wrote down the positive things, having children, time commitment, aspects of life that impact on the quality of your marriage. In column 2, he wrote down the impacts about to marry or not to marry. And what Darwin did was he assessed the costs and benefits. It sounds a bit like Sheldon, doesn't he, of the decision. All right? And he did this a few years after his famous voyage on the HMS Beagle. So he'd come back from that famous voyage and he was now ready to settle down. And so Darwin took this particular approach to this decision. And here's a reproduction from his diary. So Darwin is here trying to make a decision, a complex, important decision that will affect the rest of his life. So he starts to talk about things like if he has children, that's constant companion, friend in old age. But if he doesn't marry, he won't have children. So there's no second life. In other words, when he was talking about that, there's no future for him. He then talks about if he does marry, he'll have charms of music and feminine tit-chat. We'll try and forgive him for his time-limited concept of what marriage was about. He talks about it would be intolerable to think of spending his whole life but not having children. So Darwin's concerned here that, gee, there is more to life than just my life. He then, but however, recognises that if you have kids, you cannot read in the evenings, fatness and idleness. So he's got some concerns about that. He likes to have the thought of a soft wife on a sofa and a good fire. So he's got an idea of family life. But then he recognises what if his wife doesn't like London? You know, that could be a real problem. In other words, what Darwin is doing is this kind of mental accounting. And he was making his decision, trying to come up to this. Now, you might think, gee, that sounds a bit strange, but I've actually talked to people who've done this sort of thing when buying a car, when deciding on a career. They've actually put the pros and cons down on lists. So this is not as uncommon as it might sound. By the way, Darwin did marry, and he and his wife had 10 children. So he obviously found time for doing what needed to be done. So, how do people like Darwin make decisions? I find how they do this interesting, but I wanted to study it scientifically. I wanted to do it rigorously because that's my particular approach. Now, we could ask them how they make their decisions. We could talk to people, and we've seen studies that do this. But people often don't know what motivates them to make decisions. They're often uncertain about it. They're unclear, or they're sort of caught between two options. I don't know if you've ever had the situation where you've been faced with two options and you've thought, oh yeah, I'll choose this one, and then you feel regret. So it's almost like you wanted the other decision or the other option to be the one you really picked. So people are often have difficulty identifying their own motivations. So my colleagues and I decided that we'd do something a bit different, and we invented a computer program that tracks the information people use to make decisions. So we wanted to basically follow their behaviour in the acquisition and use of information to make particular decisions. The program is called ASP, for the Analysis Simulation Project, Scintella. Now, I'd like you to meet some of the people, because these are the people behind this. The first one there, of course, it's me on the left, but it's my good friend Alex Waring, who happens to live in Melbourne. He was one of the originators of this program. Then there was a group of us. Again, you can see yours truly, second from the right. And there's my colleagues, Pierce, Wajma and Nikki, going from left to right. So these were the people we got together and worked in this team to invent this particular program. All right. Now, our experiments in decision making have been over a range of topics, but one of the ones that we did first off was kind of like investigating a murder, a whodunit. And so what we do is we ask our experimental participants to imagine they're either police officers or jury members, and they've got to decide the guilt or innocence of people. Now, this is a complex problem. They are confronted often with a great deal of evidence, that is, people in real life doing this sort of job. So we've been investigating these sort of questions for about 10 years, and the experiments we have been doing have utilised our ASP Scintella, and one of them is who is the guilty, or who's the most likely perpetrator of this murder, the whodunit. Notice I say most likely. In other words, there's no absolutely smoking gun that can point to a single person. In other words, all the information they have in front of them, they must make a decision from with some lingering uncertainty. And that's commonly the case in many jury deliberations. There's no fingerprints that makes the identification of the perpetrator absolute. So you've got to try and live with that uncertainty. So I'll just go through this reasonably quickly because it's fairly well known from TV programs and so on. But you're a police officer investigating a murder case. Jack Southwell is found dead. It happens on the Easter long weekend. You've got the time of death is between 6 and 10 p.m. Okay, so it's a pretty typical sort of situation. So there are lots of persons of interest, and these are the persons of interest, and from them you will find the most likely perpetrator of the murder. Okay? So there's, obviously Jack Southwell isn't the murderer, he's the victim, but there are people like Mary Southwell, Jack's wife, Tom Southwell, Jack's brother, and so on. You've got a list of people to choose from, and as you're going through the evidence, you're meant to be making the decision who is the most likely perpetrator, all right? So most probable or most likely murderer. You have 40 minutes. In other words, there's a time constraint. The time constraint means that people have to make their decision, in a sense, without sort of too much delay or procrastination. We do that for a reason. So, this is what the front page of the ASP Scintella program looks like. It has 3 basic parts. You'll see there on the upper left-hand quadrant, a series of cells, or we call it the information matrix, and I'll show you a bigger version of that in a moment. And on the right, we have a space, that's the workspace, where people can copy and paste information from the cells. And then down the bottom, you will see the sort of rectangular space where people can write a report saying why they chose, who they chose as the murderer. And on the right-hand side, you'll see some boxes or buttons where you check to find out or indicate who you think is the most likely murderer. So there's the information matrix. In the case of the murder investigation one, there's 64 cells, and 8 by 8. There's over 6,500 words of information. Much more than you can read in 40 minutes. You can't read every cell. You've got to make some selections. You've got to say, what am I going to open first, second, third? Maybe if I've forgotten what I opened first, I'll go back to it and open it a second time. Our computer program tracks all of that behaviour so that we know exactly what people did in the matrix. In other words, we're assuming that what's important to people, they'll open first. What's next most important, they'll open after that. So here's an example, just to show you what it's like. This person's opened the third cell in the fifth column. They've thought, oh, now Michael Smith, full range of movement. They've copied and pasted that into their workspace, and then they've thought, right, if he can't move his arm, that's a pretty important piece of information of why I've eliminated this person, Michael Smith, as the perpetrator. All right? So this is the idea. They can do all of this, and all of this information is also retained. So what have we found out? Well, people who have a psychological need to have clarity and certainty tend to seek confirmatory evidence. In other words, there's two sorts of evidence in the matrix, that which will confirm a particular suspect and that which will probably say they didn't. Michael Smith not having full use of his arm is an indication that he's unlikely to be the murderer because the murder weapon was a throwing star, a kind of specialised knife. So that's confirmation bias, that certain psychological characteristics seem to lead people to look for evidence that confirms the particular suspect. They never go and search for what's called the negative evidence. People who decide early, and we can track this through some particular things we do, people who decide really early get it right about 16% of the time. People who suspend judgment and keep looking for information get it right 63% of the time. So that the idea of holding off making a judgment, which is kind of something that I would think is pretty common sense, is actually backed up by our experimental results. And we found too that there are simple ways that we can help people improve their performance on this task. There's a thing called the counterfactual thinking exercise that we've designed, and we actually found that this really helped people prepare their thinking to answer this sort of question. Now, this is some of our research. There's a lot of research being done by other people, and where there is so much research to be done. But one of the interesting things that we have found is these are the characteristics that we are pretty sure from the research make up a good model of how people should reason effectively. So firstly, not making up your mind early unless the evidence is really strong. Consider all the evidence or factors, not just the ones you either know or like. Too often, people are distracted by things that, oh, well, I already know about that, so that's obviously true. Or, I like that piece of evidence, I'll have that as the thing that I use to justify it. You've got to take a broad rather than narrow perspective. If you get too narrow too quickly, don't tend to do so well. And often it's very valuable to talk over one's thinking with people who hold different views from yourself. Now, many of these things, I would hope, are part of your common sense, part of your folk psychology. But we've now got empirical evidence, rigorous evidence, that tells us these are pretty solid ways to go. Now, a very important researcher in this field by the name of Philip Tetlock found that there were two kinds of decision makers in his long study. He did a study over 24 years, so a pretty big one. And he found that there were two sorts of people. There were the hedgehogs, which in our case are a bit like wombats, and they know one big thing and they try to make everything in the world fit with the one big thing, whereas foxes know many things and stay open to the possibilities without procrastinating. Now, that second one, being a fox, takes more effort and energy. So it's understandable why it's not an easy way to be. But if you want to make quality decisions and have good evidence and good reasons for doing it, that's what we now know. That's the state of our knowledge at the moment. Okay, now I suppose I would hope some of you will be interested in studying psychology. And of course, psychology is a very wide-ranging scientific study of mind and behaviour. We study things about personality, development, motivation, perception, by all these things, social psychology, mental health. Often people associate psychology with, psychological disorders and psychological processes. Well, that's true, but it's far from the only thing that we study in psychology. I think it's interesting, and studying psychology at university provides a whole lot of important general or generic skills like communication, and I've just mentioned scientific reasoning, critical independent thinking, and there are so many career paths. Not everybody who studies psychology is going to be a registered psychologist. That requires 4 years of study plus postgraduate work. Areas of professional practice are very wide-ranging: counselling, educational, developmental, work in government or in corporations. There is the thing that I'm doing, that is research and teaching and training, and many others. Psychology is a field that has very broad application. Now, I imagine if you're thinking about studying psychology, one of the things that often students ask me is about pathways to registration. This particular slide shows some of the ways in which you can do it at Macquarie University. For instance, in 2015, if you got a general ATAR of greater than or equal to 75, you could start a BA. If you got an ATAR of 83 or above, you could start in specifically studying psychology, or after studying in semester 1 and you got a GPA of 2, you could start then studying psychology. So there's a number of ways to enter psychology. The BPsych Hons is the one that you'll often see in the UAC books. It has an ATAR of 94.15, but let me assure you there's no difference in what you study between the BPsych Hons and the BA or BSc in psychology. To be a registered psychologist, you've got to go through the same pathway and the same number of units and do honours and so forth. Why study at psychology? Well, our research, teaching and strength. We were recently rated the 48th best psychology department in the world. Now that might sound like that's low down, but that's out of literally more than 1,000 universities. Flexibility of your learning. We have the technology and resources. And for those people who ultimately come to live near us, there is the Epping-Chatswood Rail Link, which gets you into the city or into other venues. And psychology at Macquarie has a third-year unit, which we call the capstone unit, where you actually have real-world experience. That is, you get placements. So thank you for attending and listening to my talk. I'm now more than happy to take questions. That's a very interesting question, because I think there are a number of crossovers, because psychology as a separate discipline didn't come about until early in the 20th century. In fact, one of the most interesting things is that the great American psychologist, as he was known, William James, actually finished the last 10 years of his academic career as a professor of philosophy. And one of the points that's often made is that philosophy has a very important role in terms of helping us come to grips with the models we have of human thinking and behaviour, and whether or not they're ethical, whether or not there's a moral dimension, which is very important in many areas. I have some PhD students studying with me, and we're looking at moral psychology. So that has a lot of crossover with philosophical discussion of the topics we're looking at. So philosophy, in fact, is a close cousin of psychology, and it's interesting to note in the modern university context that there is now a movement within philosophy to do what they call empirical philosophy, which when you start to see what they're doing, it looks an awful lot like psychology. So there's this kind of movement away and movement back together between philosophy and psychology, and in particular your view of human beings in areas like free will, in areas like moral decision making. So there's quite a lot of crossover. had I been asked that question while I was making the transitions that I've made, I'm not sure I would have known how to answer it. So I think I can answer it best in retrospect rather than during the process. But if I were to be asked that now, and as I have been, I would say that one of the issues was about flexibility in terms of wanting to know what was appropriate for what I needed to know at the time, and that then led me to future study. Now, my particular career path is obviously in the education helping sciences sector, whatever way you put it. First in teaching, then in universities and so on. So I think that one of the things that strikes me is that when I was in high school and I got that sort of task to be the supervisor of boys, I thought, I've got to do this as well as I can. So I looked up how I might do that. And I was then willing to undertake... I did all my psychology study, by the way, for 10 years part-time. I didn't attend full-time anything. And that's because I had a family and a mortgage and 2 sons and 2 dogs, you know, the whole shebang. Oh, wife, yeah. So I couldn't just take it off and do it full-time. But nevertheless, I was committed to doing it as best I could, given the role that I was... And when I was doing that study, things started to emerge which really interested me. And so I pursued them even more. And that pursuing my interest, yet at the same time being realistic about it, I think is the important aspects of my life that helped me do the transitions. I was able to leave teaching and go into the family court. I remember at the time... thinking I'm going back to square one. I'd been teaching 12 years. At that stage, I had accrued what they used to call List 2. I could have been a head of a science department anywhere in the state, but I was leaving that behind. But my real interest was in another area. That was the psychology I was studying, and so I found that to be one of the important facilitators of making the move. So I think that kind of idea of following my interest and at the same time making sure I was really following something that I could get a sense of purpose in and that I really wanted to do. Those were important things to me. Taking a step back isn't the easiest sort of action to take, but I think from my point of view, it was the desire to be in an area that really interested me, and that I never took what I would call suicidal step backs. So I never took a step back where I put my financial responsibilities to my family in danger. I didn't do it excessively. I didn't sort of suddenly take a job where I wasn't able to pay my mortgage. So I think that I was still being responsible, and so the step backs weren't huge. They weren't catastrophic step backs. And I think that's also important, that you're able to take a step back that's recognition that it is starting again, but not to the point of being what I would call unable to maintain just a sensible life. If you go to the Macquarie University website, if you're interested in the entrance requirements or other courses that we have here, I'd encourage you to do that, because we've been revamping and revitalising our website, and it's pretty friendly and funky right now. I'm sorry I used the word funky, but it just came out. Just if you're really interested, by all means, you should find the webpage quite clear, because we're trying to make it both friendly and informative so that students can get the answers they'd like. And you can look up my email address on that webpage if you wish, and if you've got a specific question about anything I've said, or a question about psychology that you think I might be able to answer, by all means feel free to email me. When I was a younger man, yes. I can remember doing it for buying my first brand new car. And boy, that was a big step, you know. And I think as I've done more research on how people make decisions, I've found that method isn't a bad one. I mean, I don't think it's a bad method. But the problem was I was only able to put down on the piece of paper what I already knew, or what I had thought about, I never went and spoke to anybody who had a different view or had a different perspective, say on buying a new car compared to a used car, or it was very insular. It was just inside my head. So yes, I did do it, but I think what I've learnt now is that if you're going to use that kind of pros and cons method, it's really important to take the piece of paper with you and maybe talk about it with someone you respect and might have a slightly different perspective, just so that you're not kind of still in your head, if that makes sense. All the best. Bye-bye.